Morning, folks. So I'm testing a new intro to my podcast episodes. So picture the scene. It was the autumn of 1996. Jeff Bezos had just raised $8 million, putting Amazon's valuation at around $60 million. Revenue that year was $15.7 million. Small, yes, but growing at a huge rate, and it had caught the attention of two men who'd built an empire out of books, the old-fashioned way. Leonard and Stephen Riggio, founders of Barnes & Noble. Their chain was the heavyweight of American booksellers. Like, they had hundreds of superstores, nearly $2 billion in annual sales, and they had a reputation for crushing smaller rivals. That autumn, the Riggio brothers, they invited Jeff Bezos to dinner in New York for what was described as a frank but cordial conversation. They told him they admired what he'd built, acknowledged that Amazon had an early lead online, but, they said plainly, if Barnes & Noble launch its own e-commerce site, their scale and publisher relationships will allow them to, and I quote, surpass Amazon easily in both selection and price. So they floated alternatives, partnership, maybe a strategic alliance, maybe for Bezos to join them and lead Barnes & Noble's online strategy. Bezos declined. Steve Riggio left the dinner unconvinced and said after the meeting, and I quote, "That purely virtual model won't cut it in the long term." Now, to understand how Bezos ended up across the table from the biggest booksellers in America just over a year after setting up Amazon, we have to go back to where it all began. Jeffrey Preston Bezos, he was born on the 12th of January 1964 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His mother Jacqueline, she was just 17, still in high school. His father Ted Jorgensen was 19, and the young couple married before Jeff was born, but they divorced after 17 months, and Jorgensen ceded custody and soon lost contact entirely. In 1968, Jacqueline remarried, and her new husband was Miguel Mike Bezos, a Cuban immigrant. He'd come from the United States alone at 15 as part of Operation Pedro Pan. That program was set up in the early 60s, and it had flown more than 14,000 Cuban children out of Castro's Cuba to begin new lives in America. Bezos never saw his biological father after he left, and he had this to say about Mike Bezos. "The reality, as far as I'm concerned, is that my dad," referring to Mike Bezos, "is my natural father." The family moved to Houston, Texas, where Mike began his career as an engineer at Exxon, and a few years later his job took the family to Florida. Now, Bezos' maternal grandfather, another interesting character, he'd been a regional director at the US Atomic Energy Commission, and he owned a 25,000-acre ranch near Cotulla in Texas. And young Bezos, he spent his summers there fixing windmills, building fences, repairing heavy machinery, and apparently castrating cattle. I just can't see Jeff Bezos doing that. But one thing that became very noticeable from a very early age was Bezos' mechanical streak. I mean, family stories tell of him dismantling his crib with a screwdriver because he didn't want to be confined. Later, he built an electric alarm for his bedroom door using Radio Shack parts. It was a DIY security system to keep his younger siblings out, because Jacqueline and Mike had two other children, Mark and Christina. I suppose you really could call Bezos a gifted child, because a book on gifted education from 1977 featured a Houston sixth grader called Tim, and it described him as a prodigious reader with intense scientific curiosity. And author Brad Stone, who's written two fantastic books on Bezos and Amazon, he revealed that Tim was actually Jeff Bezos. And his teachers also remembered him clearly. Here's a quote from one. "Even when he was in high school, all the teachers who taught him knew Jeff was special and that he was going places." And Bezos throughout this time always had a huge fascination with science fiction and space, because summers at his grandfather's coincided with NASA's Apollo era, and those televised launches, they really left their mark. He devoured sci-fi books. In June 1982, he graduated valedictorian out of a class of 689. I had to double check that. Like, how big are the schools in America? There are about 60 kids in my year, like two classes of about 30 each. Anyway, that summer he launched his first entrepreneurial experiment. It was a 10-day camp for local kids called the Dream Institute, and he and a friend charged $600 a head and taught everything from Gulliver's Travels to black holes and nuclear war. And that autumn, Bezos enrolled at Princeton University. He was intending to study physics, but he quickly found out that, maybe he wasn't quite up to it, because one classmate solved in minutes a math problem that had taken Bezos hours. So he quickly switched into electrical engineering and computer science. And he described himself as a nerdy student. He was so immersed in computers and labs that he kind of missed out on the wider campus life. So, of course, academically, he thrived, and he graduated summa cum laude in 1986 with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. And the timing was ideal. This was the mid-1980s. It was the dawn of the personal computer boom, and Wall Street firms, they were really looking for top technical graduates. So Bezos had offers from Intel, Bell Labs, Anderson Consulting. He turned them all down, and instead he joined a small fintech startup called Fitel. It was trying to build a digital network for international trade. I suppose a kind of communications platform before the web existed, and Bezos was tasked with setting up operations, and he quickly earned a reputation for problem solving, and within a year he was promoted. But Fitel, it never really took off, and 2 years later, in 1988, Bezos joined Bankers Trust in New York as a product manager, building software to manage the firm's portfolio of pension funds and other investments. And again, he thrived. Within 2 years, he was vice president, one of the youngest in the company's history. Then in 1990, Bezos was headhunted by D.E. Shaw and Co. This was a hedge fund that had only been founded the year previously by David Shaw, a Columbia computer science professor, and it was getting a very, very strong reputation on Wall Street for using pioneering algorithms and computing. So it was a culture of scientists and mathematicians applying data to commerce, so a perfect fit for Bezos. And Shaw, he recognized something in Bezos. He later described Bezos as sort of an entrepreneurial, odd jobs kind of guy. He had the knack for spotting problems and devising creative solutions in any area. Interestingly, I like this bit, while Bezos was at D.E. Shaw, a consultant administered a personality test to the executive team, finding that they were all introverts, but the least introverted person on the team, and thus I suppose the token extrovert, was Bezos. And another interesting story from that time is that Bezos kept a sleeping bag in the office. Again, Bezos excelled. He was promoted quickly to senior vice president by 1992, and he was one of the firm's top 4 executives and the youngest. So you have this pattern of Bezos outperforming and impressing, one of those people that just stands out. While he was at D.E. Shaw then, he met Mackenzie Turtle. She was a fellow Princeton graduate and she was working as a research associate. She asked him out first and they married in 1993. By then, Bezos, he was comfortable. He was well paid, well regarded, and looking forward to a very, very successful career on Wall Street until a single statistic changed everything. In the spring of 1994, he discovered that internet usage was growing at 2,300% a year. And that number, it just, as you can imagine, it stopped him in his tracks. And here's a quote from him. "Things just don't grow that fast. It's highly unusual." And that started me thinking, what kind of business plan might make sense in the context of that growth? And so with Shaw's approval, Bezos began mapping out possible internet businesses for the firm to invest in. He listed around 20 products that might sell well online, and books stood out because there were millions of titles in print, but no bookstore could carry all of them. And crucially, big distributors, they already had electronic catalogs, so the infrastructure existed, it just hadn't all been joined up. So Bezos realised that there was a huge opportunity here, and he wanted to go for it himself. He went to talk to David Shaw, who was his boss, his mentor, and by all accounts, one of the sharpest minds on Wall Street. Shaw suggested they take a walk. So the two of them spent a couple of hours circling Central Park, talking through the idea. And Shaw, he understood the impulse, that entrepreneurial pull, but he also spelled out the stakes. Bezos had a great job. He was earning a 6-figure salary, and that would increase to 7 figures given Bezos' career trajectory. Shaw told him to take 48 hours to weigh up his options. And to help him make up his mind, Bezos used a system or a device or whatever you want to call it. It's called anyway the regret minimization framework. So this is basically a very good and really easy to implement decision-making strategy that involves projecting yourself into the future, typically the age of 80, to determine which potential actions you would most regret not taking. As Bezos said himself, I want to have lived my life in such a way that when I'm 80 years old, I've minimized the number of regrets that I have. And that mindset, that obsession or maybe focus with the long term, it didn't just help him make up his mind about whether or not to start his new company. It would define everything that followed. Here's another quote from Bezos. If you think about the long term, you can make really good decisions that you won't regret. Long term is crucial to this story. And so in July 1994, at the age of 30, Bezos resigned from D.E. Shaw. He and Mackenzie packed their belongings into a 1988 Chevy Blazer. This was a gift from his dad. And they drove from New York to Seattle. He chose Seattle as his base because of its proximity to major book distributors, and it had a rich tech talent pool. Now, the working name initially was Cadabra, as in abracadabra, but when his lawyer misheard it as cadaver, Bezos, he knew he had to change it. He wanted something memorable, and he wanted something that began with A, because early web directories were alphabetical. So, flipping through a dictionary, he stopped at Amazon, the largest river in the world. As Bezos said, it blows all other rivers away. And that was the scale he wanted. And this thing about scale is important because books were always going to be just the first product. Bezos had always intended Amazon to be more than just books. And his parents were early believers. And you gotta give them credit. They put in nearly $250,000 into the business, a very significant portion of their life savings. And Bezos warned them they could lose it all, but they still backed him, and it paid off. The exact value of their stake hasn't been confirmed since 1999, but it is believed that they have held on to a good chunk of their shares long term. And again, while it's impossible to get an accurate figure, most reports put their net worth at $30 billion. Now, his brother and sister, Mark and Christina, were also early investors, putting in $10,000 each. And I couldn't find out when or if they sold any or all of their shares. The only figures I could find was a Bloomberg report from 2018 that put both of their net worths at around $600 million each. So, good for them for giving their older brother money when he needed it. Like, that's the thing about the Bezos family. They seem like a very close and loving family. Jeff describes Mark as his best friend, and Mark actually was part of the very first Blue Origin crew that went into space in 2021. Forgive the quick interruption, but I want to let you know about our subscription service. For just $1.99 a month, you get every weekly episode completely ad-free, so you can enjoy the story without any interruptions. Subscribers also unlock a library of special episodes from when Keith was still co-hosting with me, including a 3-part deep dive on Disney and a 2-parter on Guinness. They're brilliant. Now, Keith isn't part of the show anymore, but I still have a good few hour-long episodes that I recorded with him, and they're going to be released on the 1st of every month over the next few months, again, for subscribers only. All of that for just $1.99 a month. If you'd like to join, it's really simple. On Spotify, just tap on the little lock symbol next to the bonus episodes in the feed. On Apple Podcasts, click on the show and you'll see the option to subscribe. Or if you prefer Patreon, head to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. There's also a link in the About section at the top of the podcast page to the Patreon page. And of course, if subscribing isn't for you right now, that's grand. Following the show and telling a friend about it is a huge help. Alright, back to the story. Now, getting back to business. Bezos and a handful of early employees, they were working out of this cramped garage, building everything from scratch. The website, the systems, even the desks, because resources were so tight that Bezos bought cheap, solid core doors from Home Depot and bolted on 4x4 lumber legs. And these door desks have turned into legend, and recent photos show that Bezos continues to use a door desk in his office as a reminder about the importance of penny pinching. On 16th of July 1995, Amazon.com launched. Now, just as a side note, Bezos wasn't the first to sell books online. A Cleveland entrepreneur, Charles Stack, he launched the first online bookstore 3 years earlier as this dial-up service called Bookstacks Unlimited. He moved into the web in 1994 with the brilliant URL books.com, but it remained relatively small, and it was later acquired by Barnes & Noble in 1996 for $4.2 million. In its first week, Amazon, with almost no advertising, no marketing budget, it pulled in $12,000. The second week brought in $14,000, and the numbers kept accelerating. So how did it get sales in the door from the get-go? Because, as I said, it didn't have a marketing budget. Well, its earliest customers came from Bezos and the early team interacting directly with online communities where book lovers, academics and programmers were already talking to each other. People would ask things like, does anyone know where I can find a hard-to-get copy of X? And the Amazon team would simply reply, we've built an online bookstore, we ship anywhere, here's the link. And it spread fast because these users, they were natural sharers, and there was also a big wow factor. Here's an online bookstore promising over 1 million titles, which was unheard of. But of course, Amazon held almost no inventory. If a title was ordered, someone would race to buy it from a distributor or publisher, then pack it and ship it. Most of the packing happened on the concrete floor of the garage with Bezos himself taping boxes late into the night. And the customers that they got stayed and kept buying because of the experience. Amazon replied to emails the same day, sometimes Bezos himself. They sent updates on every order so the customer always knew what was happening. At a time when, buying online was risky, Amazon felt reliable. Also, Amazon priced most of its books at 10% below list prices and bestsellers with 40% off. And again, in the brick and mortar retail world, that kind of margin sacrifice was unthinkable. In the office, I love this, they'd wire the bell to chime each time a customer clicked purchase. Within weeks, it rang so often they had to switch it off. I can imagine how annoying that bell got. But the real breakout moment came when Amazon was added to Yahoo directory homepage, which in 1995, that was effectively the front page of the internet, and overnight, that brought in a flood of new traffic. By the end of 1995, after just 5 months in business, Amazon had more than $500,000 in revenue. It had shipped to every state in the US as well as other countries, and now the company needed more money to fund its expansion. So a local angel investor set up meetings with Bezos and dozens of investors around Seattle and Silicon Valley. But it wasn't as easy as you might think. Netscape had gone public in August 1995, and while many point to that as being the beginning of the internet boom, it still took just a little longer for investors to cotton on what was happening. The internet still felt speculative, and the people that Bezos was pitching to, they were not impressed with Amazon's $6 million valuation. They thought it was way too high. And Bezos said of this fundraising round, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. He did roughly 60 pitches that went nowhere. And ultimately, he cobbled together a syndicate of just 22 angel investors. These were friends, former colleagues, local business people. They each put around $50,000 in early 1996 for a total of $1.1 million for about 20% of the company. Now, I tried, but it was impossible to track when these early investors cashed out. I'm guessing a lot of them would have cashed out at the IPO, and we'll get into the IPO in a minute. And if they did, then that 50,000 turned into somewhere between $4 to $5 million. So that is a fantastic return on investment, almost 100-fold. Of course, if any of them held on to their shares for longer, the value just went up and up and up. So as revenue kept growing in 1996 and the hype around the internet was taking hold, Bezos was now in a stronger position to approach larger VCs. General Atlantic offered a deal that valued the companies around $10 million, and Bezos used that as leverage and approached Kleiner Perkins. This was the premier Silicon Valley firm where John Doerr, its head partner had backed Netscape and Sun. And Doerr flew down to Seattle and said that he was blown away by Bezos's drive and the scale of his ambition. In other words, Amazon is not just about books. And so Kleiner invested $8 million for 13% stake at a $60 million valuation. And Bezos had one condition, that John Doerr join Amazon's board, because Bezos wanted Doerr's clout, as well, of course, his counsel, and Doerr readily agreed. Doerr is a fascinating character and is, I think, one of the most influential investors of the last 50 years. I'm definitely going to do an episode on him. So with 8 million in fresh capital, Bezos made the strategy explicitly clear. Get big fast. And while this was very much the mantra of lots of B2C online companies at that time, unlike most of the others, Bezos had the vision and, I think, the strength of character to ensure that he wasn't going to be bullied or pressurized into compromising on this. This is a quote from Bezos to the New York Times. "We could be profitable now. It would be the easiest thing in the world to be profitable. It would also be the dumbest." He knew he was in a land grab, and to succeed, he knew he'd have to stick to his guns, and he did. And by late 1996, growth had drawn the attention of the industry's Goliath, Barnes & Nobles, and I described that meeting at the start of this episode. Bezos politely declining their offer to be absorbed, and Steve Riggio saying that purely virtual model won't cut it in the long term. But Bezos declined not just because he was fiercely independent. He was also convinced that Amazon's speed and technology focus, that he could out-innovate Barnes & Noble's online efforts. And so in 1996, 180,000 customers, 15.7 million in revenue. And as we go into 1997, revenue is set to increase almost tenfold. And Amazon announced that they were going to float. And in their IPO filing, Bezos made it quite clear. Amazon would forego short-term earnings to capture market share aggressively. And I know I keep repeating this point, but I just believe it's vital in understanding not only how Amazon succeeded, but also in understanding Bezos. By consistently coming out and letting people know what his strategy was, he was reinforcing not only his strategy, but he was also letting Wall Street and investors know that he wasn't going to be pressured into deviating from that he was the boss. He took a real strong leadership position, and that is crucial. He also made it clear in the filings that books were just the start, and here's a quote from those filings. "Our vision is to be the world's most customer-centric company, the place where people can find and discover anything they might want to buy online." On May 15th, 1997, Amazon went public, valuing it at $438 million. It was one of the first pure internet IPOs, and its strong reception, it helped open the floodgates for dozens of more .com companies over 1997 and 1998. By the end of 97, sales had increased almost tenfold to $148 million. The customer base was now 1.5 million. It had shipped to more than 100 countries. And in 1998, Amazon launched their UK and German websites, having bought leading online booksellers in both countries. And crucially, they also bought IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, for $55 million. I love IMDb. Now, the IMDb acquisition, while it's pretty small in many ways and is largely forgotten, to me, it stands out as being very significant. They bought IMDb because it gave them something they couldn't quickly build themselves: the world's most complete catalogue of films and audience tastes. Millions of people were already using it every day. At that point, Amazon was starting to move into music and video. So the prize here was the data. What people watched, what they liked, what they searched for but didn't buy. Because Bezos, he has always loved and leveraged data. Data has been crucial to Amazon's success. And so between June and August 1998, Amazon launched their music, their video DVDs, and by Christmas of that year, the bet was paying off with sales of 610 million. I mean, the growth, 148 million in 1997, 610 million by 1998. And more importantly though, it proved Amazon could enter new categories and win. As Bezos told employees, "We're not in the book business or the music business, we're in the customer business." I love that vision that he has because it's a huge vision. It's a huge goal to aim for. And it's fair to say that customers loved Amazon. But what about the people who worked there in those early years? Now, former engineer Steve Yegg, who worked there from 1998 to 2005, he once described the culture as horrible. But he said Bezos himself was difficult to dislike, and I quote, "It's hard not to like a person who's that smart. He had this electric presence, a magnetism to him that was unmistakable." Yeg also said that Bezos challenged people constantly, but he never saw Bezos lose his temper, never heard him swear, not once in almost 7 years of working at Amazon. Now, that's one view. But Brad Stone's 2013 book, The Everything Store, it paints a slightly different picture of a leader with kind of sharp edge. Bezos, he wrote, was known for deploying withering put-downs in meetings. He'd fire off lines like, "Are you lazy or just incompetent?" or "Why are you wasting my life?" And if an employee failed to impress, he might simply pull out his phone mid-meeting or leave the room entirely. So yes, he was demanding, impatient, but I think that's kind of expected if you're trying to build the biggest online company and you're growing at such a fantastic and fast rate. I mean, it must have been exhilarating, and I can totally understand why Bezos might have been a bit short with some people. It's not an excuse. I don't think I'd act like that, but I think it's understandable. Now, there are other issues definitely with Amazon's treatment of employees, especially in the warehouses, but that doesn't really feature until much later, so I'll leave that for another episode. I'm just covering up to 1999 in this episode. Bezos's own wealth, it surged. I mean, by 1999, at 35, he was worth roughly 10 billion. And yes, he still drove a 1996 Honda Accord. It was, I suppose, a message that cash would fund growth, not perks. In early 1999, Amazon raised 1.25 billion in convertible debt. Like, at that time, it was the largest such issue by an internet company, and it gave Bezos years of runway to push expansion without fretting over quarterly losses. April 99, Amazon launches auctions. This was a direct challenge to eBay, and while auctions itself never really took off, it evolved into Amazon Marketplace, which became, of course, one of Amazon's biggest growth engines. And to cap it all, at the end of 1999, as revenues hit 1.64 billion, and that was up from 610 million from the previous year, which was up from 148 million the year before. Like, the growth is just unbelievable. Time magazine named Bezos Person of the Year and dubbed him the King of Cyber Commerce. And what a ride. Like, within 4 years, Amazon had gone from zero to a $30 billion company. So where are we? What are my thoughts on Jeff Bezos 1964 to 1999? And look, there are still a few more chapters to come on this story, and I'll cover them, over the coming years. And I'm sure I'll be pretty critical of many things, especially their treatment of warehouse staff. But looking at early Amazon, up to 1999, what stands out for me is a founder who's driven, with a huge vision and in a massive rush, because he knows timing is everything. He knows it's a land grab. And yes, he's impatient, and yeah, he can be sharp with employees, but I get that. I mean, that kind of drive, that obsession you have as a founder, it can lead to a bit of steamrolling. I'm not excusing it, but anyone who started a company knows that feeling. And I balance that with a guy who comes from a loving family and has their full support. And that suggests to me someone grounded, someone who values family. And to me, that says a lot. We've also got a young Bezos who spotted the potential of the internet very early and went for it 100%. There's a real steeliness there as well. He knew that the prize was huge and that to win, he'd have to sacrifice short-term gains. He was playing the long game from the start. And so Jeff Bezos 1999, I like and admire him, and he makes for a cracking story. Which brings me to listener emails, and I've got one from Lucas who'd love to hear the story of Enzo Ferrari. Believe it or not, he wasn't on my list, but he is now, so thanks a million, Lucas. I can't wait to cover Ferrari. And remember, if you've got any comments, corrections, or stories you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.